Chapter 2 draws on the philosophy of biology, arguing that, although we now know that some versions of the nature-nurture debate were deeply misguided, it is important to discover, for any particular feature of human cognition, the ways and extent to which the feature is shaped by 1. Genetically inherited information, 2. Culturally inherited information, and 3. Information derived directly from the environment in the course of development. Chapter 2 also includes an overview of contemporary cultural evolutionary theory, showing how it can be applied, not only to cognitive products, grist, but also to cognitive mechanisms, mills. Chapter 3 focuses on features of distinctively human cognition that have been shaped primarily by genetically inherited information. It surveys behavioral and neurological evidence that, far from being blank slates, or just like the minds of chimpanzees, the minds of newborn human babies are equipped with high-capacity mechanisms of learning and memory, species-specific attentional mechanisms, and a tendency to find social cues especially rewarding. Chapter 4 examines the nature of cultural learning that enables cultural inheritance, the cultural analogue of DNA replication, and provides an introduction to the heart of the book, chapters 5 to 8. Each of these chapters examines a type of cultural learning: selective social learning, imitation, mind reading, and language, and argues from the available evidence that its distinctively human characteristics depend on culturally inherited information. I focus on the mechanisms of cultural learning, the cognitive gadgets that enable humans to learn from others with extraordinary efficiency, fidelity, and precision, for two reasons. First, these distinctively human cognitive mechanisms are especially important because they are gifts that go on giving, culturally inherited skills that enable the cultural inheritance of more skills. Second, evolutionary psychologists and cultural evolutionists disagree about the origins of many cognitive characteristics, but both parties are convinced that the mechanisms of cultural learning are cognitive instincts, not cognitive gadgets. This consensus suggests that the mechanisms of cultural learning are the hardest nuts to crack, the cognitive mechanisms that are least likely to be explicable as products of cultural evolution. Social learning is said to be selective, or to involve social learning strategies, when the impact on behavior of observing another agent varies with the circumstances in which the encounter occurs, or with the characteristics of the observed agent, or model. For example, when older models have more impact than younger models. In Chapter 5, I argue that most selective social learning, found in non-human animals, children, and adults, is due to domain general learning and attentional processes, that is, to processes that have not been specialized for social interaction, let alone for cultural inheritance. However, a small proportion of social learning strategies, found only in adult humans, depend on explicit metacognition, on thinking about thinking. These, and only these behavioral effects, are genuinely strategic and genuinely examples of cultural learning. The evidence suggests that, like other explicitly metacognitive rules, these metacognitive social learning strategies are learned through social interaction, culturally, rather than genetically inherited. Imitation occurs when an observer copies the topography of a model's action. Observing the way that parts of a model's body move relative to one another causes the observer to produce movements in which the parts of his or her own body move in a similar way. In Chapter 6, I agree with the century-old view that imitation is special, much more highly developed in humans than in any other species, and dependent on mechanisms that are not involved in other kinds of learning. I also agree that these mechanisms contribute to the fidelity of cultural inheritance. My rebellious streak comes out only in relation to the question of where imitation comes from. Offering an original theory of the mechanisms mediating imitation, and a wide range of empirical evidence in support of that theory, I argue that the capacity to imitate is acquired through socio-cultural